Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So this is what some people might consider a rather silly question, but actually it's quite a fair question, especially if you do gaming, or even if you're just curious about how to use swords and maybe it's not something you actually physically do yourself. And which is easier to use out of a longsword and a katana? You know, I've specifically chosen in this case a katana which is larger than normal. Okay, so this is the Dynasty Forge, one of the Dynasty Forge offerings, and I've got an Albion longsword here, the Ringek, and you can see that the size, there is a bit of a length difference, but not a huge amount. And the reason for that is to make it a bit more of a fair comparison, because in fairness, historically, most katanas, we should also say maybe tashis as well, are not quite as long as most longswords. But just to caveat that, you do get shorter longswords and you do get larger Japanese swords. I'm not going to get into the terminology of the Japanese swords, because obviously we could go into odashis and nodashis and all of this kind of tachis and other sorts of Japanese sword that do come in different sizes and fittings and stuff like this. But generally speaking, let's just talk about the Japanese sword versus the European longsword. Now, why might you need to know which is easier to use? Well, you know, like I say, it might be maybe you do role-playing games or maybe even LARP or something like that. There does seem to be a perception, and I've kind of, in many of my videos, I've tried to kind of point out that this doesn't always work like this in reality, but there does seem to be a perception that some weapons are easier to use than others. And is that basically true? Well, I suppose it's basically true, but often the margins are quite narrow. So what I'm going to start off by saying is, generally speaking, these are actually pretty similar swords, despite the fact they're from opposite sides of the world. And fundamentally they've got some design characteristics quite differently. This is two-edged, this is one-edged, this is slightly curved, this has got a disc guard, this has got a cross guard, this has got a pommel which can't be detached and thrown incidentally. This doesn't have a pommel as such. The tang construction is quite different. This is closer to a full tang in terms of it's a wide tang pegged through, whereas this is a full tang that goes all the way through and is peened at the pommel. So there are some basic differences on the point as well. That's quite, I'll come back to that in a second. The point, the symmetrical, essentially spear point of the European sword compared to the asymmetrical point in line with the back of the blade on the Japanese sword. So there are some fundamental design differences. But if you actually come to use one of these swords, so let's imagine a scenario, you know, you could say, I don't know, post-apocalyptic or zombie apocalypse or a survival situation or whatever, and you come, there are two swords lying on the ground, you can only pick up and carry one, you can't carry two swords, it would be too cumbersome, and you pick up one and the other, and you have a look at them and you wave them around. Fundamentally, okay, so I imagine I know nothing. Well, some people might argue I do know nothing, but let's say I just pick up these swords and I go, okay, so that feels quite, it's quite a choppy sword, and I can feel the curve in my hands, which aids the edge alignment slightly. And it feels like it has quite a lot of presence up here, and I can see that it doesn't have an awful lot of hand protection. I pick up the European sword and I think, okay, well that's balanced more back towards the hand, so in a sense it's a little bit more nimble at the tip, it feels lighter at the tip, but it doesn't feel like it's going to hit with as much authority as the katana. That being said, I can feel that there's a cross guard in front of my hands, which again aids with edge alignment in a different way to the curved blade. And it's got a pommel at the back end, which feels different in my hand. Now, there is a degree of preference involved in this, okay? So based on your prior life, what you've done, maybe you played baseball or golf or other sports, or maybe you're, you sit at a desk and work at a desk, or maybe you're someone who works with their hands, either in crafts or, heavy kind of manual labor. So how your hands interact with the weapon, this is often something, it's actually, in fairness, not something I've spoken about an awful lot on my channel, but it's a very important thing. How the weapon interacts with your hands, it's almost a conversation between your hands and that weapon. It is the interface between your body and brain and everything else and the thing which is going to hit the other person. Obviously you might hit them with other things as well, but generally speaking, okay? So when you pick these two things up, although they're fundamentally similar, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, they do feel differently in the hand, okay? They move differently and they feel a different shape in the hand. The longsword tends to have a narrower grip because of the tang construction. Japanese swords have fatter grips, and it's textured with the obviously with the shark skin or ray skin, and then with the silk wrap over the top. So it's a very different feeling in the hands, quite grippy, but it feels fatter, and you don't feel the pommel at the back end. So it feels different in the hands. So there is always going to be a degree of personal preference involved in this. So we pick these two things up. As I've spoken about, the longsword tends to balance a bit more back towards the hand and feels a bit more nimble at the tip, probably feels a little bit more like it wants to thrust a bit more. The katana feels like it wants to swing a bit more, so they do feel differently. But the similarity, fundamentally, okay, in the grand scheme of things, if we're comparing all implements that you might defend yourself with or hit someone else with, everything from rocks to shovels to missile weapons, firearms and everything else, these are fundamentally similar objects. They can both cut, they can both thrust, they're about the same length, they've got handles of roughly the same length that obviously predominantly want to be held two-handed. So whichever one of these you pick up, if you know nothing before, because that's really what this question is about, which is easier to use. If you know nothing before, your main instinct is probably going to be to hit, yeah? And you can do that with either of these very effectively, certainly effectively enough to take out opponents and this kind of thing. So often we get fixated on, which one is, if we're quantifying it, if this one cuts 12, does this one cut a 10? Is this slightly better, slightly worse at cutting, but maybe slightly better at thrusting? And we get on this, particularly on this channel and similar ones, we get into these minutiae of details. But you have to remember that they are minutiae, they are details. In the big, broad brush strokes, big picture view, both of these things can cut, both of them can stab, and both of them are gripped with your two hands, and you move them in a very, very similar way. Even, it has to be said, if we look at the fencing systems which these weapons were used with, so if we look at medieval longsword treatises, German, Italian, whatever else, or if we look at Japanese kenjutsu techniques, actually we notice a lot of similarities, and obviously most people on this channel probably know this by now. Even a lot of the guard positions you might see the sword used in, this, are the same guard positions you find in European and Japanese. So it's a fundamentally similar weapon. So you could argue, which is easier to use? You could say neither, because they're in the same category. They're both medium to long length two-handed swords that you can cut and thrust with and have a two-handed grip. In that sense, they are fundamentally in the same category. But there are some differences between them. So to actually answer the question of which is easier, we really do actually need to look at the details at least a little bit. We can say, broadly speaking, they're the same. It's down to personal preference. If you're a completely untrained swordsperson, but not a swordsperson, if you're a completely untrained person who for some reason needs to pick up and use a sword, there's not really any great functional difference between each of these things. They will both do the job. You can both defend and attack with them in a similar way. You hold them in a similar way. They move in a similar way. They're similar length. Okay. So fundamentally, you could say the same. It's just down to personal preference. You might pick up that one and think, yes, that feels good in my hand. You might pick up that one and think, that feels good in my hand. But actually, is one of these slightly more advantageous for a complete noob to use than the other? And I'm perhaps going to surprise you slightly by saying yes. Now, I have said this before on the channel, but I think many, many years ago, so a lot of you viewing this now might not know this, but my view is that for a complete beginner to use a sword as a weapon, the easier one of these two to use is the katana, or rather the Japanese sword, any form of Japanese sword. And now, why is that? Well, there are a couple of main reasons, but the fundamental and principal reason is that it seems to be overwhelmingly human instinct to chop and to hit, okay? So most people, despite the fact we know this is a very good thrusting sword, most people, given a weapon like a sword, it could be a stick, it could be a mace, it could be a hammer, axe, whatever. But most people's instinct, going all the way back into our evolution, probably back to our ape ancestors, is to swing, okay? And generally to swing downwards as well. So most people's instinct, given this and told to hit something, is they will grasp it in two hands with their dominant hand at the top of the grip, almost always, and they will pull the thing back, and they will hit downwards with it. So if the basic human instinct is to just give basically downwards chops with a sword, I have to say that the Japanese design of sword is more favourable for that than the European longsword in general. Now, I just caveat that again slightly with the fact that there is obviously variation in Japanese swords. Some of them are more tapered, some of them are more balanced to the hand, towards the hand, and so on and so forth. But the general, if you take the general average, similarly with European longswords, obviously some of them are broader. This is a particularly pointy type from the 15th century, 14th, 15th century. There are types which are broader at the tip and far more effective for chopping. But the general tendency is that Japanese swords are specialised towards the cut. And we can see that in the design of the tip. Now, it's not to say that obviously you can still stab someone with any pointy object, but this is a sword which has made compromises. The longsword is a sword that's made compromises to make thrusting more effective, particularly thrusting through things like gambesons and mail in the gaps of plate armour. So this is almost a specialised thrusting sword, or rather it's a compromised sword that has given up certain things in order to become better at thrusting. Whereas the Japanese sword, you could argue, it's given up a few things to become better at cutting. These asymmetrical points do not penetrate certain things very well. If you try thrusting this through a gambeson, I can assure you it will be much, much harder work. It's a much broader, fatter tip, and being asymmetrical, it will be much harder work than the tip of the longsword. The longsword will go through gambeson or mail much more easily. The katana is designed this way so that you can still cut very, very effectively up at the tip area. Trying to cut up at the tip area with a longsword is, well, certainly with this particular longsword, I can tell you because I've had it for years, is not very beneficial. If you want to cut with this sword, you have to cut down here. And that's when we come into something called centre of percussion. Now, many people watching this channel will know what a centre of percussion is. In fact, I'm going to put the Japanese sword down because it's easier to demonstrate with the European sword. So a centre of percussion is what we could call the sweet spot. I'm not going to go into the physics of it because I don't understand all the physics of it. But generally speaking, any lever will exert the most force on the target when you hit it around here. Okay? If you hit with the tip, it will kind of have a bouncing effect and it will feel very, very weak. Obviously, if it hit down here, the motion of the blade is not travelling very fast. It's not going to hit with a lot of force down here either. So the sweet spot is around here. And you'll also find that with a stick. If you just take a stick and hit yourself or hit something else with it, hit a tree with it, if you hit with the tip of the stick, it won't hit with as much force as if you hit a bit further down from the tip. Now, what's interesting is the European swords have a more unforgiving centre of percussion. Okay, so as I mentioned, because of the shape of the blade, although just to caveat that with the fact that there are different types of European swords and broader ones at the tip will strike more effectively towards the tip. But generally speaking, they're less forgiving. With the Japanese sword, whilst you do still have a centre of percussion, you can cut very effectively with more of the blade. So, we've got a few things here which are going in the favour of the noob who wants to just do this, okay? The noob who just wants to hit with the sword. And if you just want to hit with the sword, having a curved blade is advantageous. It helps with edge alignment and potentially reduces the amount of surface area in contact with the target at the point of impact, therefore increasing the energy transferred into the target. I won't talk about the cross section of the blade because that's too much of a variable thing. So we've got the slight curve assists to some degree, probably debatably, but primarily the fact that this blade is very stiff and it feels like a chopping blade. It's got a point of balance further from the hand, and you've got a tip which is designed to optimize cutting towards the end of the blade. So in other words, to cut a long story short, stiffness, curved, shape of the blade, particularly shape of the tip, and centre of percussion related to that, means that this is a very, very forgiving sword. And as I pointed out, I think in a couple of videos in the past, if you want to start test cutting, for example, a katana, if you have access to one, is actually a really good sword to start test cutting with because they're very, very forgiving. And we sometimes jokingly, and I know it's a bit disrespectful, when we're having cutting parties or whatever, we refer to the katanas as noob swords, because if you're a new person and you want to cut, then a katana is a good place to start out. It's quite forgiving. It's good. It's good at cutting. So despite what lots of people think about me, I'm usually talking about European weapons, and in the early days I certainly made lots of jokes about the katana, which really was a response to how deified they have been. In fact, the katana is a great cutting sword. So, to sum up, if you know nothing at all and you want to pick up a sword, it could be in a video game, or it could be in a role-playing game, or it could just be in your head in a dream. If you have these two swords to pick up and you don't know how to use either sword, particularly if you're not fighting armoured opponents, if you're fighting armoured opponents that might change things and you might go for the longsword. But if you're just fighting general whatever, you don't know opponents, normal unarmed opponents or zombies or something, then the katana, I would argue, is the way to go. But I'm just going to remind you that these two swords are very much in the same category, and there isn't a huge difference. So if you're writing stats for video games or role-playing games or whatever, these should be very much in the same ballpark. Okay, this longsword probably a little bit more nimble, a little bit quicker, certainly in the tip movement and control, and the katana a little bit more powerful in the cut. And that's it. I hope that's been a silly distraction topic, nothing serious, nothing historical or academic really at all, just a bit of fun. Which is the easier sword to use out of a Japanese sword and a European longsword? I'd actually say the katana, or the Japanese sword, although there isn't really a big difference in it. Thanks for watching, give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!